On today's show, we'll be talking about the ghost of a beloved pet, red-eyed entities, a loving mother spirit, and much more. All coming up on this episode of Paranormal Mysteries. Thank you all for joining me, and welcome. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. I hope that everyone's had a great week, and before we start, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please remember to subscribe, share, and review the podcast. This supports us by helping new listeners to discover the show. And if you'd like to support us even further by becoming a patron or by donating, please visit us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. These links and others can be found in the show notes. And if you've encountered the paranormal and would like to share your story, please email me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. All experiences, no matter how big or small, are always welcome. And with that in mind, today's first story comes to us from Brian and Savannah. And they say, "Good day. I'd like to start by saying that my fiancé and myself have been fans and listening to your podcast for over 6 months. We have had many minor experiences and a few more substantial experiences since moving into our rental house. It seems a spirit has followed me from an apartment I previously rented. At this apartment, I lost countless glasses and dishes. They would fall off of our countertops, tables, and anywhere they were placed, even tumbling when on the floor. I would wake up in the middle of the night and hear a glass break, and I'd find broken glass during odd times. It would break as I studied for school, while reading in a calm and still manner, and at random, and that was before we moved. We now live in a town that has deep history of Native American roots. There are many burial grounds, and Native American wars were fought all around this small town. Arrowheads and artifacts are also very common. Many interactions with wildlife set the tone for our experiences. While they are normal on their own, they are strange as they seem to only happen during the most coincidental moments. For instance, screaming raccoons, turtles showing up, and birds getting trapped in our chicken coop. Each happened at a major day in our life. In our bathroom, we have had a nightlight sensor since we moved in. It can only sense right in front of it, which is only in the bathroom. Lately, we have felt more and more spirit energies, and each night the sensor has been turning the light on, with both of us being still and in bed, as if trying to wake us up. What makes this very odd is that the light only started turning on after the night that we saw a strange owl, and after hearing a knock on our door. We noticed that one of our dogs has been barking towards areas with nothing that we can see, such as towards an empty room, or even straight at the wall. And we half-joked that she can sense the spirits. One night I woke up thirsty and walked to the kitchen to get some water. I stepped in a dark, sticky puddle, and I remember washing my feet off and going back to bed without further investigating, but I was worried that it could be blood. In the morning there was no sign of any puddle. I decided to try and send a message to this entity, and I placed pictures, candles, notes, and offerings, such as a gallon of milk and eggs. The energies calmed down for a while, and the sensor stopped going off in the middle of the night, but it has recently picked back up again. I think the spirit wants a different offering. I hope this helps some of your listeners. Thanks, Brian and Savannah from Florida. Our next story of the night comes from Chrissy Lee, and Chrissy Lee's story is called House of Darkness. Chrissy Lee says, "Hello, Nick. I now live in Tennessee, but I grew up and lived in Florida most of my life. The house we lived in Florida, my dad had bought from my aunt, his sister. She dabbled into witchcraft while she still lived there, and I truly believe that is why this house is ate up with darkness. I've had so many experiences there, and I will start with my first experience. It all started when my parents divorced. My dad got a new house, so my mom and I stayed where we were. I was around 10 or 11 at this time, and I remember everything so vividly. I had a bunk bed, and directly across from that was my closet door. I had a friend over on this night, and we were lying in our beds that night, ready to sleep. She rushed down to my bed out of nowhere and whispered, "What is that?" I then looked over to the closet, and there were 3 sets of red eyes staring back at us. There was a huge blanket of fear that washed over me, and I tried to get out of bed to turn on the lights, but I was unable to move. We started crying and holding on to each other, and the eyes were moving closer, and we then heard a growl. At that point, I started screaming for my mother, and before she got in my room, the eyes were right at our faces, and all we could smell was something rotten. My mom then flicked on the light, and they were gone. She immediately felt the presence and started to anoint my bedroom. It was absolutely terrifying. This is my second experience. We always locked the door. We were 2 females living alone, so we always made sure we were secure. This time I was about 15, and I remember waking up to get a drink, and when I walked to the living room, the door was wide open. There was a black figure there at the door with red eyes. I just stood there and stared. I had no idea what to do, and I started feeling sick to my stomach, and I called for my mom. It felt like hours, but it was just seconds before she came to the living room, and the figure vanished. I rushed and closed and locked the door again, and when I passed the section where the black figure was, it felt heavy and dark. I ended up sleeping with my mom that night, and had a dream that my little sister ate us. I've always been prone to see or feel things, and I have so many more experiences with this house, and outside of it, if you'd like to hear more. I love your podcast, and I appreciate the fact that you don't make people feel crazy with their stories. Our next story of the night comes to us from Talon, and Talon says this: "Hey Nick, I have been listening to your podcast, and I heard about the man with the top hat. I have even seen him, so I decided to share. My mom and I went to Savannah, Georgia to help my sister move to college. I was excited to be there so that my mom and I could go on ghost adventures together. That night, we booked a place at a hotel and put our stuff there before heading to bed. I remember waking up around 2:30ish when I felt like I was being watched. I looked around but barely saw anything, so I just pulled the blanket over my head. I could sense the energy was bad, and I didn't know what to do. I looked back around 10 minutes later, and I saw it. A man in a top hat with no face. I remember getting scared, and I grabbed my phone to text my friends who have had experiences with this kind of stuff. I told them about seeing a faceless man with a top hat, and what they said scared me. My friend told me that they had seen him before, the faceless man with the top hat, who has been a violent being to them. My other friend told me about how they had been watched by the man, and how he had caused my friend to have a panic attack. That just made me feel even worse, and I was terrified. The last thing I remember was feeling a bony hand on my back before I passed out. I woke up that morning with bruises and burns. Thank you for letting me share. Talon." Our next story of the night comes to us from Valerie, and Valerie's story is called Ghost in My Brooklyn, New York Apartment. Valerie says, "I am so happy I found this podcast. Listening to other stories makes me feel like I am not alone in the way I think about the paranormal. I listen to it as I work from home. I have a few stories about strange encounters. Here I will tell you one of them. When I was in my 20s, I lived with roommates in a second-floor apartment. On the first floor lived the owner of the house, an 80-year-old lady who was happy to have young people upstairs to help her out. Her husband, who was a doctor and practiced out of their basement, had died years before we moved in. The basement was a very creepy place, with patients' beds and medical supplies that looked like they'd been sitting unused for decades. Something ghostly was living throughout the house. Many times when I would go to sleep, I would hear very loud, fast footsteps above me in the attic. It sounded like a heavy-footed person, pacing back and forth, very quickly, maybe searching for something. I knew it wasn't my 80-year-old landlord because she can hardly walk, and there was a lock on the attic door, so me and my roommates don't have access. There was no explanation for the footsteps, and of course my roommates thought I was crazy, because I was the only one that heard it. About a year into living there, the old lady died from complications of surgery, and the strange happenings started happening more often, and now one of my roommates witnessed it as well. Me and one of my roommates, Aaron, were sitting in the living room, which is attached to the kitchen by an open doorway. My roommate went to put a dish in the sink and came back to the living room instantly and sat on the couch. A few minutes later, I walked to the kitchen to get a drink, and when I walked in, every single cabinet door in the kitchen was wide open, and there are 11 cabinets. I immediately called for my roommate to come into the kitchen and asked her if she had opened them all. She said that she didn't, which is true, because for the seconds she was in there, I did not hear any noise except her putting a dish in the sink. We then called for my other roommate, who was in his bedroom, although we knew it was impossible that he opened the cabinets, because he would have had to pass us in the living room to get there, but we asked him anyway. He thought we were both crazy. One day, all of my roommates and I went to the park near our house to play softball and hang out. Me and my roommate Aaron got tired and wanted to go back home, so we left our other friends at the park and walked back. The evening before this, we had to change a light bulb in our kitchen, and we used a ladder to do so. When we were done with the ladder, my roommate placed it against the door in the kitchen, which we kept closed and locked because it led to a staircase in the back of the house, leading to the downstairs apartment, basement, and the attic. When Aaron and I walked into the apartment, you could see straight into the kitchen, and in the kitchen you could see the ladder had fallen over. Upon getting closer to the kitchen to go pick the ladder up, we noticed that the door we kept locked was wide open. But even scarier was that the ladder had fallen onto the stove, and all the burners on the stove were turned on. We quickly lifted the ladder and turned off the burners. We were very freaked out. I was panicked because I had just got a new kitten a few weeks before this happened, and she was missing. Aaron and I suspected that she was down in the basement, but we refused to go down and check. We tried to lure her up by calling for her and banging on cans of food, but she didn't come. We then called my other roommates to come home quick, and once they got home, we told them our story, and they laughed and said that we were crazy, and that there is a logical explanation for everything that happened. But they couldn't tell us what or how. I couldn't understand how they could just be so quick to brush it off as a coincidence of some sort. It angered me, but the more upset I got, the more they made fun of me. But when I asked one of them to go down to the basement to find my kitten, they refused and said, "Hell no." My cat finally came upstairs after 3 hours, looking petrified, and she stayed in my lap the rest of the night. I moved out shortly after the latter incident, as I had already had plans to move in with my boyfriend at the time. Maybe the ghost wanted to give me one last spook before I left. After these encounters, I now understand why people keep these stories to themselves. My roommates made me think and question myself, even though someone else witnessed it with me. I guess you have to see it for yourself to believe. Valerie. Our next story of the night comes to us from Taylor. And Taylor says, "Hey Nick, I found your podcast recently and have been listening at work for the last week. I love hearing the stories and have been debating on sharing my own. I've never really been afraid to share. I just didn't think my experiences were significant enough. I'll break them into sections involving a creepy room, my dog, and my mom. I don't recall anything before I moved to Missouri. I was about 7 when we moved into the house I'm about to talk about, and most of what I have to say is just minor encounters. As most houses, there's always one room that just feels off. This was our spare bedroom. Nothing ever happened in there, but there was always the feeling of being watched. There was one of those older oval stand-up mirrors in the corner, and I never liked it. I always feared I would see something looking back if I were to look at it. Moving on some years later, I had a friend over. She was over all the time, and we had just laid down to go to bed, and it was all quiet. Out of nowhere, my TV turned on, and we sat up, looking at each other. I thought the dog might have stepped on the remote, but he wasn't in there. Turning it off, we laid back down and slept, and the next experiences came some time later. Our dog Shadow, a German Shepherd, had grown old and sick, and we had to put him down. Devastated, the house seemed so lonely without him. I had grown up with him, and he was my best friend. Shortly after he was gone, I started to hear things. 2 separate times, I heard what I believed to be him in my room. Once a soft jingle next to my bed, as he always wore a chain instead of a collar. And this is what I heard. The next time was a huff, like what dogs make when they lay down. The third time that I believe I saw him was in the dining room. I was sitting at our desk on the computer, and off to my right side was an entertainment center with glass doors. I saw what looked like a dog-sized shape move across the bottom of the door in the reflection. The encounter wasn't mine, but my aunt's. She was staying with us for a few days, and one night she was sleeping in my dad's bed. He was gone for the night, and she wanted to be away from my cousins. At some point, she felt something large jump up on her. She said, "Shadow, get down." And just like that, the thing jumped down. About a year or so after this, in 2009, my mom passed away. Losing her was the hardest thing, but even with her gone, I knew she never fully left me. A few months later, my aunt told me about a card they had bought her for Mother's Day, one that she would never receive. This card stopped working after it was purchased. However, the week they returned from her funeral, the card played without anyone being near it. For me, there were 2 separate occasions I had been driving alone and had been passed by family members going the opposite way, and both times they would call and ask where I was going. After I'd tell them, they would then ask who I was with, and both times there was no one in my passenger seat. I'm convinced it was her they saw protecting me in my car. She's still around me after almost 12 years. I feel it. She even plays jokes and hides my stuff. It drives me crazy, but it's comforting. Thank you for taking the time to read this. There's a few more things I could share and add to this if you're interested. Keep up the good work, and I can't wait to hear more. Taylor. Our last story of the night comes to us from Sarah, and Sarah's story is called A Disagreeable Sighting. Sarah says, "Hi Nick, I've been enjoying your podcast from Bristol in England where I live, and it is really helping me get through lockdown and hearing about other people's experiences. I have had many experiences myself, especially from when I used to run ghost hunting events at haunted buildings in the past. However, the oddest experience that I've had came at a time when I really wasn't expecting it. I used to help out at a weekly club called Rainbows for young girls, which took place in a local church. One evening after the session had ended and the girls had been collected by their parents, myself and the lady who ran the group were outside of the main church entrance, standing on the pavement and talking. It was 7:30 p.m., but it was in the winter, so it was dark. However, we were on a small residential street, standing directly beneath a street lamp. We were talking about how the night had gone and what we planned to do the following week, as we did every week. As we were talking on the now empty street, a lady came towards us. She looked to be in her 60s, with shoulder-length gray hair, and didn't look at us as she came towards us. Her eyes were cast down towards the floor. She was on the same pavement as us, and we were blocking her path. So we moved closer together to make room, and she walked behind my friend. The lamplight showed her clearly. She was the only person we had seen, and was so close to us that we couldn't ignore her. So both of us watched her as she passed. It was only when, instead of continuing along the street, she turned and walked into the church driveway that we stopped talking and turned around, and we wondered if she had turned up late and was looking for one of the girls who had gone home. She walked purposefully towards the church, but not through the main door entrance that we had exited from. She went to the side of the building. There is nothing there except the side of the church and a 7-foot wall. As we watched, she just disappeared into the darkness of the church wall, no more than 10 feet away from us. Completely shocked, we walked over to where she had disappeared, and there was, of course, nothing there. She had just disappeared into the wall. The odd thing was that when we talked about it after, and 6 years on, we still argue over it. I saw an old lady with gray hair and a quite jowly, stern face, but my friend is equally insistent that she saw a young girl in her 20s with blonde hair. We weren't out looking for ghosts, and we were in such a mundane setting for something so extraordinary to happen that I tried to avoid the area. I can cope with the fact that we saw a ghost, but the fact that we both saw something different is something I can't understand, and still leaves me shaken to this day. As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the show. And a special thank you goes out to Brian and Savannah, Chrissy Lee, Talon, Valerie, Taylor, and Sarah for sharing their experiences with all of us. If you've witnessed something that you can't explain, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit us at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a safe and healthy weekend, and we'll see you back here on Monday with our next episode. From all of us at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.